All right, so here it is, the long-awaited final exam review. So as I mentioned in class on Monday, originally we were supposed to meet in class this coming Friday, which is the 7th, but we are not doing that. I am canceling class on Friday. Yes, I know it's a Friday, but it's a makeup day for Hurricane Florence, and it was intended to be a Monday to make up that time. Instead, I'm recording this online lecture as the final exam review. I am presenting the exact same PowerPoint that I would have presented had we met on Friday. And certainly I'm more than happy to field any questions you may have regarding the final exam once you watch this. If you want to stop by my office this week, or if you want to send me an email. I know on Monday when we met and we talked about the final that some of you were not too pleased with the fact that we have a sit-down written final. And let me just say that I've done a final exam in this class every semester ever since I started teaching it. I am a firm believer that the final exam is a good way to measure your understanding of the core concepts of the class that we've talked about all semester. Going back to the very beginning of the semester, day one, I said this class is about making good, smart decisions, and that's basically what this final exam is asking you to do. I'm not creating a 50-question multiple choice exam where you're regurgitating all the information that you've learned. We've already kind of done that with the first two tests anyway. This is an application of what you know in specific situations that I provide to see if you're understanding the concept, if you can apply them to situations, which is why I have crafted it in the way that I have. So I know it's been a rough semester, and I know everyone's ready to be done, and I know maybe in some of your other classes there have been changes in final exams. I understand that. Trust me, I'm very sympathetic, but in order to maintain the integrity of the class as I have been asked to do, and to make sure you're coming out of the class knowing the same amount as anyone else who's ever taken it before, this is a necessary step. So I'm more than happy to answer any questions or concerns you may have about the final exam, but the one thing I will not put up with, as I mentioned on Monday, is whining about it. So just wanted to kind of get that out there. Okay, so let's talk about what the final is consisting of. It is 8 questions, and that's it. 8 questions, all case study based. So before you completely freak out, first of all, the 8 questions have multiple parts. These are not 8 essay questions. The questions are rather long, but they're not as long as a case study that you had to read for your paper. I'm not going to give you a 5-page case study and ask you a question about it. The questions are basically, I'd say most of them right around a half a page, maybe 3/4 of a page long. And you read the situation that I provide, and then I will ask you 2 or 3 questions regarding that situation. Some of the responses will be as short as just a few words. Some of the responses may require you to write a sentence or 2. There's only one question on the exam that I would truly consider to be an essay, and it is the last question where you're going to have to write a couple paragraphs. But it's not something that's super writing intensive, okay? It will focus on, the questions will focus on each of the areas of law that you see right here, each of these topics right here. Ethical philosophies, advertising, libel, invasion of privacy, news gathering, obscenity and indecency, and copyright. So you may notice that, first of all, I didn't list First Amendment. Well, that's because I am not going to ask a question on the exam specifically about First Amendment. And by that I mean hate speech, or the Brandenburg test, or the Chaplinsky case, or the Holmes test. Because I feel like we've kind of already covered that pretty exhaustively. The essay question on your first test, if you can remember back in October, dealt pretty specifically with First Amendment law. So I feel like we've already kind of gotten through that, and I think you all have a pretty solid understanding of what that is. Okay. The second thing you may have noticed also is that there's only 7 topics here, and I say that there's 8 questions, and the reason for that is because some of these areas of law, especially something like libel or invasion of privacy, there's a lot to them. They're very dense. There's a lot of parts to them. So there are 2 questions on the final that focus on the same area of law. If you don't see it on this list, It's not on the exam. I am going to do a very brief overview of all these topics in just a minute. A couple things I want to mention before we get into that. Number one, you only need to bring something to write with. You will actually write your responses on the exam itself. I will bring plenty of paper if you need it. I will bring lined paper if you prefer to have something that's more lined paper. And also something that I am doing, one concession that I am making, I'm not completely cold-hearted, is that I am going to allow you to bring notes to class. I don't want you using the textbook. I don't want you using your laptops. But any notes that you've taken over the course of the semester or any notes you want to create between now and Monday, you are allowed to bring those. Just remember during the exam as you're shuffling through papers to not be too loud, be respectful of your colleagues because they are deep in thought as well. But I am allowing you to use your notes, so hopefully that'll make this a little less stressful for you going into your final. And that's basically it. I'm going to present you with a situation, give you some detail about that. You need to identify the area of law that the situation deals with. You'll need to know kind of the components or what the criteria is or are for the different areas of law, and then you basically tell me, who would win a case and why. So it's pretty straightforward. So now I'm going to do a pretty quick little overview of some of these areas dating back to the very beginning of class, very beginning of the semester. You just wrote about these philosophies in your case study analysis paper. So hopefully they're still pretty fresh in your mind. You will need to know the names of the philosophers and what their philosophy is. So make sure you remember that virtue ethics is Aristotle, that categorical imperative is Immanuel Kant. In virtue ethics, emphasizes character over behavior. You have the golden mean, where you look for a common ground between two extremes. You have the duty-based approach of Immanuel Kant, where you're looking at what is the right, quote-unquote, right thing to do based on telling the truth and being honest and being a good person. This is a decision that may upset some people, but the underlying principle is more important than people being upset. Kind of the opposite of that approach is the consequence-based approach, utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill. You're evaluating potential outcomes and consequences, and you're trying to minimize harm. So it's not focused on the underlying principle, but pleasing the most people. And then egalitarianism, where you strip away all the superficial stuff and you look at things from different points of view, especially those that may be the most disadvantaged. We talked about the object with our morals, the duties and loyalties, and the object being the person or group of people who were the most at risk, yet had the least amount of power in a possible decision. Then we get into advertising law, because again, there's nothing specifically or explicitly about First Amendment on the exam, although pretty much all of these areas of law deal in some way with the First Amendment. Advertising law deals with commercial speech, persuasive speech, which was considered a second-class form of speech for many, many years. It was not afforded the same level of freedom and protection as, say, political speech was. And that is until the 1970s, where Bigelow versus Virginia was the first court decision that did give protections to commercial speech. And this basically means it prevented the government from restricting commercial speech that was for a legal product, that was not misleading. There was a certain set of rules that came out of that with the Central Hudson case and the Central Hudson test, looking at, if the government were to want to restrict a certain form of speech, is there a substantial reason for that, and is it a nice fit? And so those 5 steps of the Central Hudson test obviously gave a lot more structure to the protections for commercial speech. Then we talked about false advertising, a representation, omission, or practice that is likely to mislead a consumer. And we talked about it has to be a material claim. You have to be saying that the product can do something that it cannot do. The example that we looked at in class was Listerine, which has gotten in trouble numerous times over the last few decades. Early ads made claims that it could soothe the sore throat and cure the common cold. It can't do that. Later, much more recent ad campaigns said it was just as effective as floss. Well, there was no scientific information to back that up, and they had to apologize for that ad. They had to do corrective advertising. So those are material claims. Now, if you wanted to say that Listerine is the most refreshing mouthwash, now you're getting into what's called puffery, which is a subjective claim, and puffery is completely legal. So just know the difference between a material claim and a subjective claim and the legality of the two. Then we got into the big section on libel. Libel is a huge area of law, one of the most debated and complex forms of media law. What is libel defined? A false statement damages the reputation of a person, lowers their esteem in their community. What are the criteria for proving libel? Publication, identification, defamation, falsity, and fault. If it's a true statement but it's unflattering, it's not libel. If it's a false statement, it might be considered libel. The hardest criteria of this, of course, is proving fault. And we looked at New York Times versus Sullivan, which kind of set the precedent for determining fault in a libel case. Looking at, well, what is the degree of the fault? Is it negligence, which is a failure to exercise reasonable care, or is it a complete and total disregard for the truth, or knowingly printing something that is false? That's actual malice. It also looked at different status levels for individuals. If you're a public official, you're holding office, oftentimes you're voted by the people to that office. You're able to spend tax dollars. As a public official, you should expect a certain amount of scrutiny. People are going to say things about you that you may not like. If you're a public figure, you are considered to be in a position of privilege. You have media exposure. You have access to the media to explain yourself. So therefore, the courts have decided that if you're a public official or a public figure, you have to prove actual malice to win a libel case. If you're a private person, you only have to prove negligence. So it's all about where you fall on the spectrum of classification as far as your ability to defend yourself or how visible you are in the public eye. Then we got into privacy law, the 4 torts of privacy law. Appropriation being the oldest form of privacy law. And this deals with someone's name or likeness that is used without their permission for commercial gain. And appropriation deals specifically with commercial gain. So if your likeness is used for an advertisement without your permission, you could possibly sue and win a case for appropriation. False light is the least recognized type of privacy law, simply because it's very similar to libel, it's very similar to intentional infliction of emotional distress. Its criteria is a little more inconsistent. The actual malice requirement is required by some states in false light cases, but it's much more inconsistent. And so because it's so complicated and inconsistent, a lot of states don't even really have a false light law. But getting into probably the 2 most common areas of invasion of privacy, the 2 areas that we think of the most when we think about what invasion of privacy means, that's intrusion and publication of private facts. Intrusion being, how is the information gathered? Is it a situation where you are in the comforts of your own home? That's considered to be a very private area. You have what's called a reasonable expectation of privacy. Are you somewhere where the public is not generally allowed? Then you may be able to say you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. Okay, so that's that phrase that kind of comes into most intrusion cases. Was there a reasonable expectation of privacy? Publication of private facts deals more with how has that information been published, and does someone have the right to do that? Here we're talking about, is it a private fact? Is it something that truly not very many people outside of maybe your closest of close friends and family know about you? Is it a private fact? If so, is it considered offensive to a reasonable person? And is it of legitimate public concern? And it's basically been deemed through the court system that if something is of legitimate public concern, then that trumps offensiveness. If it's something that a handful of people know about you, then it's truly not a private fact, so it may not be publication of private facts. We looked at the Florida Star versus BJF case, a very famous, almost infamous case in which a survivor of a sexual assault had her information published in a newspaper without her consent. And she lost that case when she sued for invasion of privacy because A, the information was accurate, it was truthful, B, it was legally gathered, and C, it was deemed to be of legitimate public concern. So that is publication of private facts tort number 4 for privacy law. Then we talked about news gathering, trespass. You as a journalist do not have special rights or privileges that cover you. You're not a member of law enforcement. Journalists are held to the same standard as any other citizen. So if you are doing a police right along with the permission of police officers, that's fine. But if they go into someone's house, you cannot do that. If they have a search warrant, you still cannot go with them because that warrant only covers law enforcement, not journalists. The First Amendment gives us a right to a free press, but it does not guarantee the freedom of journalists. Harassment and fraud. We talked briefly about the Food Lion case where ABC News had 2 of their news producers pose as Food Lion employees. In fact, they actually applied for jobs and got hired at Food Lion. And so they technically did work for Food Lion, but they withheld the information that they were also producers for ABC News to get information and make secret recordings about poor handling of meat and poultry at certain Food Lions. And this turned out to be a complete debacle for ABC News. They lost the case. It was a PR nightmare. You cannot participate in harassment or fraud as a journalist. You're not given that right. There's this idea of a reporter privilege, but there is not an actual reporter privilege. Journalists do not have any more rights to information than the general public. Then we got into obscenity and indecency. And obscenity, like hate speech, true hate speech, is one of the very few areas of speech that does not get First Amendment protection because it's considered to be very harmful to the public. So the Miller test came from Miller versus California in 1973, still the criteria used to this day. You're looking for community standards, pure interest, something that's patently offensive and lacks any serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. If you cannot justify any serious value and it is patently offensive and appeals to pure interest, then chances are it is considered obscene. What many people consider pornography or adult sexual content is not, in the eyes of the law, obscene. It might be considered very offensive by a lot of people, but it doesn't mean that it is illegal. Now, don't get obscenity confused with indecency, because if something is deemed to be indecent, such as the George Carlin routine that you heard in class, that is actually legal. It is not obscene. It just can't be broadcast at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, which is what happened in the FCC versus Pacifica Foundation case. And that led to the creation of safe harbor hours, in which more adult-themed content was pushed later in the evening when children are asleep. It's just trying to justify protecting certain segments of the population that doesn't need to hear certain content. And that gets us to copyright, which we went over just a couple weeks ago. So this should be fairly new in your brain, right? You remember most of the stuff. We're talking about books, movies, music. The examples that I use in class are kind of music-based, just because I'm a music buff and I find these cases to be interesting. But copyright law is really important because a lot of people violate it not knowing that they're violating it. Especially, especially in situations where you're using songs or someone else's content for a video production that you're doing, or for a news story that you're doing, or to put on social media or anything like that. There are a lot of misconceptions about what is copyright and what is fair use. And so it's really important to know that kind of stuff, because it can get you into a lot of trouble. So we looked at the Biz Markie case and how that was an actual violation of copyright, whereas the Two Live Crew case was an example of fair use because it was a parody. It was transformative use. In fact, just on Monday, you all watched a presentation from some of your peers talking about Weird Al Yankovic and the fact that when he does a parody, it is actually considered fair use. Now, Al has the decency to ask permission before doing one of the songs, But legally, he doesn't really have to. He does it more as a courtesy. So know the difference between copyright and fair use and the criteria of what makes something fair use. And that's it. Very brief overview. Obviously, go back through the PowerPoints, go back through your notes, go back through the chapters in the book that deal with these areas of law. Our exam is Monday, December the 10th at 3 o'clock in our usual classroom. It is at 3, by the way, not 3:30, so please be on time. And again, all you have to do is bring a pencil or a pen or something to write with. I would recommend bringing several just in case something happens and you run out of ink or something. And you are able to use the whole 3 hours. I got nothing going on. That 3 hours is for you to use. If you need the 3 hours, great. If you don't, that's fine. Most students don't. I'll be honest with you. The vast majority of students do not use all 3 hours. And but if you feel that you need to, by all means, don't feel. If you're someone who takes tests kind of slow, don't feel bad about that. I would rather you be thorough and thoughtful than try to rush through. You don't get an extra prize for rushing through the exam. And again, if you have any questions about any of this stuff, if you need any clarification on any of this stuff, you're welcome to see me. Come by, and I will have office hours through this Friday, so you can come by and see me in my office, or you can shoot me an email. I'll be happy to respond. And that's basically it. So thanks for watching, and I will see you all on Monday.